The Arizona sun burned with a cruel indifference that day, turning the red dust into shimmering gold and the bones of the earth into mirrors of heat. The desert stretched wide and merciless, a place where only the stubborn or the lost dared to wander. Among those lost was a young woman in tattered linen, her once fine dress torn by the brush and her bonnet long since gone to the wind. Her name was Ella Whitmore, daughter of a Missouri preacher, raised on hymns and Sunday lessons about virtue, sin, and salvation. But none of those sermons had prepared her for the silence of death, the kind that follows a stagecoach ambush in the middle of nowhere. Only hours before, she had been laughing softly behind a lace fan, listening to the driver whistle some cheerful tune. Then came the thunder of hooves, the gunfire, the shouts of men who smelled of whiskey and dust. When the smoke cleared, she was the only one left breathing, hiding beneath a broken wheel as the bandits galloped off with everything. Money, supplies, even the horses. Now, she stumbled through the heat, her throat raw from thirst, her lips cracked like dry riverbeds. Each step was agony. The land rippled before her eyes, mirages of green trees and water that disappeared the moment she blinked. Her pale hands trembled as she clutched a small silver cross that hung from her neck. "Lord," she whispered hoarsely, "don't let me die here." Not like this, but even her voice seemed swallowed by the emptiness. It was then, as the sun bled into the horizon, that a shadow appeared on the rocks, a tall, broad-shouldered figure standing motionless against the fading light. At first she thought it must be a trick of the eyes, but then he moved, stepping down from the cliff with the grace of a mountain cat. He was Apache. His bare chest glistened faintly with sweat and dust, marked with the black lines of tribal ink. His long hair was tied back with leather, his face carved by wind and sorrow. He carried a bow slung across his back, though he made no move to use it. When his dark eyes found her, Ella froze. Her heart pounded like a frightened bird in her chest. He approached slowly, wordlessly, like one might approach a wounded fawn. "Stay back," she managed to croak, her hand trembling as she lifted the tiny cross as if it were a weapon. "Please, I'm pure." The Apache paused, his expression unreadable. Then, with a calmness that felt ancient, he lowered his gaze and took a step back. His voice, when it came, was deep and roughened by solitude. "No harm," he said simply. "You, safe." She didn't trust him, not yet, but the way he spoke, the way his eyes held no hunger or cruelty, softened something inside her. Her knees gave way, and before she knew it, the world went black. When she awoke, it was night. The stars blazed brighter than she had ever seen, and a small fire crackled nearby. She was lying on a blanket inside a small canyon cabin, built from weathered logs and stone. A clay pot of herbs boiled faintly in the firelight. The Apache sat cross-legged nearby, watching her but not speaking. When she stirred, he rose and poured water into a wooden cup, setting it beside her with quiet care. "You drink," he said. Her throat burned with thirst and pride gave way to need. She drank greedily, the water cool and sweet. After a moment, she dared to look at him again. What do you want from me?" He seemed to consider that as though the question itself was foreign. "Want?" he repeated. "You are hurt. I help." His name, she later learned, was Taza. Once a warrior of his people, now a man who lived between worlds. His tribe had been scattered after the cavalry burned their village. His wife and child were gone, buried beneath the red earth years ago. He had not spoken to another soul in months. In the silence of the desert, Ella and Taza became two souls bound by circumstance. She, the lost daughter of civilization. He, the exile of it. Over the next few days, her strength returned slowly. Taza's cabin was simple but strong, walls of stone sealed against wind, shelves lined with herbs and animal pelts. Each morning he left before dawn, returning with cactus fruit, rabbit, or sometimes fish from a hidden creek. He never entered the cabin without first making a noise as if to warn her of his presence. She began to see the humanity in him. The scars that crossed his arms weren't trophies of violence but reminders of survival. When he moved, it was with the quiet discipline of someone who had long since learned that the earth listens to every step. One evening, as she sat outside the cabin, she saw him working silently by the fire, repairing a bowstring. She felt the weight of her father's voice in her mind. They are godless. They live by blood. Yet what she saw before her was a man who prayed in silence, not to a god she knew, but to something far older. The wind, the stars, perhaps even the memory of his lost family. "Why did you save me?" she asked softly. He did not look up. "Because I remember when someone saved me." The answer silenced her. Later that night, the desert air turned cold and the fire dimmed. She shivered beneath the thin blanket, her body still weak. Taza, noticing her trembling, took off his own fur-lined cloak and placed it around her shoulders without a word. When his fingers brushed her hand, she flinched out of reflex, but then their eyes met. And for a moment, the distance between them vanished. The silence spoke louder than words. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice small. He nodded, stepping back into the shadows of the cabin. That night, as she lay awake staring at the rough beams above, Ella realized something she had never felt before: safety. Not the kind preached from a pulpit, but the kind that came from presence. The steady sound of another soul breathing close by, watching the fire, guarding the dark. She thought of her father's teachings, of the townspeople who judged sin by skin and blood. Out here, none of that mattered. The desert did not care if a man was Apache or white. It only cared if he could survive, and if he could keep another alive beside him. When morning came, the sun rose like a burning halo over the canyon walls. Taza stood outside, sharpening his knife. Ella watched him quietly, her heart caught between fear and something she could not yet name. For the first time since she'd met him, she smiled faintly. "Good morning," she said, her voice trembling but brave. Taza looked up, and though his expression barely changed, something softened in his gaze. "Yes," he said. "Good." In that small exchange, simple, almost childlike, something passed between them. The beginning of trust. The beginning of a story neither had wanted, but both somehow needed. And as the wind swept across the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and dust, Ella knew that her life had been rewritten the moment the Apache had stepped out of the sun and into her fate. The days passed slowly, measured by the rise and fall of the desert sun and the quiet rhythm of survival. Ella healed beneath Taza's silent care, her fear fading with each dawn. The wound on her arm knit together, her voice grew stronger, and she began to move around the small canyon clearing as if it were a world of its own. Yet the silence between them remained. Thick, delicate and wordless. Taza would leave before sunrise, his figure disappearing into the orange haze with his bow across his back. He returned by midday carrying bundles of mesquite wood, roots, or the occasional desert hare. Ella had learned to keep a small fire going, boiling water or drying herbs he brought back. She cleaned his tools, mended torn cloth, and swept the dust from the cabin's corners as if by tidying his world she could give herself purpose again, but her heart was restless. Sometimes she would walk to the edge of the canyon and gaze toward the far horizon, wondering if anyone searched for her, or if the desert had already claimed her memory. When she turned back, she would see him, always near, always watchful. Taza spoke little, but his silence was not cold. It carried a strange weight, like the language of the wind itself. When he did speak, it was brief, almost careful, as though each word cost him something. "Storm come," he would say, looking at the color of the sky, or "snake trail, be careful." His English was broken, yet his meaning never was. One morning, Ella found him crouched beside the stream that trickled through the canyon's base, shaping an arrowhead from black obsidian. The sun fell across his shoulders, and she couldn't help but notice the quiet grace in his movements, the patience, the precision. "You work like a man in prayer," she said, half smiling. He glanced up at her, eyes glinting. "It is prayer," he said. "To live, to hunt, to make. All are prayer." The words struck her like scripture. She thought of the sermons her father used to give about devotion, about obedience to God's order. But here was another faith, one carved from earth instead of church stone, lived instead of preached. That evening, the wind began to rise, a low, ghostly moan that grew into a roar. Taza looked to the north and frowned. "Sandstorm," he said simply. Within minutes, the sky turned the color of brass. The wind howled through the canyon, driving grit into their eyes. Taza pulled her inside, shutting the door against the storm. The world outside vanished in a haze of red dust. The cabin shook as if the desert itself were breathing against its walls. The fire guttered low, and Ella sat wrapped in a blanket, trembling at the ferocity of the storm. Will it take the roof?" she asked. Taza shook his head. "Old storm. Cabin older. Despite his calm, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his muscles coiled every time the wind struck. When a shudder tore loose with a crack, she gasped, leaping toward him in fright. He caught her by the shoulders, steadying her. "Do not fear," he murmured, but she did fear. Not the storm outside, but the warmth of his hands on her arms, the steadiness in his eyes. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought he must hear it. The closeness made her dizzy. His skin smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. I'm sorry," she stammered, stepping back. He nodded once, releasing her. "You are safe," he said again, his voice low. They waited in silence as the storm raged. The hours stretched long, the air thick with the smell of dust and burning wood. To distract herself, Ella began to speak, quietly at first, then more freely. She told him of Missouri, of her father's church and the Sunday picnics by the river, of her mother's gentle voice singing hymns while baking bread. Her words filled the cabin like the sound of rain long absent. Taza listened. Sometimes he asked a question in that broken, thoughtful English of his. "Church, it is house for spirit?" "Yes," she said softly. "For us, it's where people go to feel close to God." He tilted his head. "And here," he said, touching his chest lightly. "You feel far from him?" She hesitated. The wind moaned through the cracks in the walls, and her answer came in a whisper. "I don't know anymore." Taza nodded slowly. "Desert is big," he said. "It make all men small. Even your God." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then she smiled faintly. "You speak more wisdom than most preachers I've met." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, a rare, fleeting thing. "I am no preacher." Outside, the storm began to die. The wind's anger eased into a whisper. Through the thin cracks in the door, the world glowed red and gold. When Ella finally dared to step outside, the canyon was transformed. The sand swept into strange, flowing shapes, the rocks polished clean by the storm's fury. It felt like stepping into another world, a new one born from the chaos of the old. Taza followed her out, standing close but not touching. "Storm make all new," he said, almost to himself. "Old tracks gone. Must make new path." Ella turned to him, her hair wild from the wind, her eyes reflecting the fire of the dying sun. "And which way do we go now?" she asked softly. He looked at her for a long moment. "Where heart says," he replied. His gaze lingered, and in that silent exchange something shifted. The space between them no longer felt like distance, it felt like invitation. That night, as they sat beside the rekindled fire, Ella found herself studying him more closely. The curve of his shoulders beneath his blanket, the line of his jaw, the way his eyes softened when the firelight caught them. She thought again of what she'd said in fear when they first met. "Please, I'm pure." The words now felt childish, heavy with the ignorance of a world that had taught her to fear what she did not understand. Taza looked up suddenly, as if sensing her thoughts. Their eyes met and she froze, caught in something deeper than she could name. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the desert lay silent, as if holding its breath. "Why do you look at me so?" he asked quietly. She flushed, fumbling for an answer. "Because I don't understand you," she said at last. "And I want to." He studied her face, his gaze gentle but searching. "Many white eyes see only hate," he said. "You see more. But be careful. Between two worlds, wind blows hard." She frowned slightly. "And you? Where do you belong?" He looked away toward the shadowed canyon. "Nowhere," he said. "And everywhere." There was pain in that answer, deep, bone-worn pain. She wanted to reach out to lay her hand over his, but fear held her still. The fire burned low. Outside, the coyotes began to howl, their cries echoing through the night like ghosts. Ella shivered and pulled her blanket tighter. When she finally lay down, she could hear him moving quietly, checking the door, feeding the fire, the small rituals of a man who had learned never to trust the dark completely. As sleep claimed her, she thought of his words, between two worlds. Wind blows hard. Somehow she understood. For the first time, she realized she was no longer the preacher's daughter lost in the desert. She was something else now, something in between like him. And though she didn't know where the path ahead would lead, she knew one thing with aching certainty. She no longer wanted to leave it. The peace of the canyon couldn't last forever. Even the most hidden places eventually echo the footsteps of men. Weeks passed since the sandstorm had remade the desert. Ella grew stronger, her cheeks no longer pale from fear or fever but touched with desert sun. The cabin no longer felt like a shelter for the dying. It had become a home. She found herself humming while gathering herbs or hanging linen to dry, and Taza would sometimes glance at her with a quiet, unreadable look, as if he couldn't decide whether to be grateful or afraid of the change she brought. But the desert is a cruel listener. It never forgets. That morning began with strange stillness. The wind had died, the birds gone quiet. Taza stood at the canyon's mouth, scanning the horizon. His instincts whispered of danger, an old, familiar whisper that once saved him in battles long past. He turned to Ella. "You stay inside," he said firmly. "What is it?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on a distant rise where dust rose like smoke. By noon, he returned with news that chilled her blood. Riders, white men, were crossing the desert, following the faint remains of the old stagecoach trail. Word had reached them that a white woman had been taken by an Apache. They called it a kidnapping. Ella's hands trembled as she set down the pot she'd been holding. "But that's not true." "It does not matter what is true," Taza said grimly. "They will kill me to make it true." She wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes silenced her. He had seen this before, the thirst for vengeance that men carried like sickness. "We'll go," she said, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We'll leave before they get here." He shook his head. "No, too late. They already come." He began to pack his few belongings with efficient, silent movements, a knife, his bow, a pouch of dried meat. But Ella stood still, her breath shallow. Something inside her refused to move. "I won't leave you," she whispered. Taza turned sharply, his face hardened. "You must. They see you with me, they kill you too." Her eyes filled with tears. "Let them. I won't run from the man who saved my life." He stared at her then, his jaw tightening. In another time, another world, he might have taken her hand. But the world they lived in did not forgive such things. Before he could speak, the sharp echo of a rifle cracked across the canyon. The sound bounced between the rocks, distant but closing fast. Taza's voice dropped low. "Inside now," she obeyed, heart pounding. From the narrow slit of the cabin's window she saw them. 3 riders in dust-covered coats, rifles glinting in the sun. Their faces were hard, their eyes full of the same coldness she had seen in the bandits weeks ago. The lead rider raised a hand. "We know you're out there, Redskin," he shouted. "Hand over the girl and we'll let you live." Ella's stomach turned. They thought her a prisoner. Taza stepped out slowly, bow in hand but not drawn. His voice was calm, measured. "The woman is safe. She is free." "Free?" The man spat. "You think we'll believe that?" He fired a warning shot that whistled past Taza's head, striking the rock behind him. Before anything more could happen, another voice echoed from the cliffs above, a sharp, fierce cry in Apache. The men looked up, startled. From the shadows stepped another warrior, bare-chested, painted, and armed with a rifle. His eyes burned with hatred. Ella's blood ran cold when she saw Taza's face. It wasn't fear, it was recognition. "Red Hawk," Taza muttered. The newcomer descended the rocks like a vengeful spirit. "You hide among the white man's kind," he hissed in his native tongue. "You forget your blood. Your wife and child, do they not weep in the spirit land for your shame?" Taza's voice darkened. "I forget nothing. But I will not kill again for hate," Red Hawk sneered, turning his gaze on Ella. "Then I will do it for you." He lifted his rifle, but Taza moved faster. With a shout, he struck the gun aside, the shot ringing wild into the canyon wall. The white riders shouted in confusion, taking cover, unsure who was fighting whom. The air erupted into chaos. Ella screamed his name as Taza grappled with Red Hawk, their struggle brutal and silent. Dust rose around them like smoke. Red Hawk was younger, stronger, fueled by fury. "But Taza fought with purpose, with something purer. You shame us," Red Hawk roared. "You choose her over your own." "I choose peace," Taza gritted, driving his elbow into Red Hawk's ribs. The fight ended in a single, heartbreaking moment. Taza disarmed him, but when Red Hawk fell to his knees, he didn't look beaten, only broken. "She will never belong to you," he spat in English, his voice trembling with hate. "And they will never let you belong with her, then." Before Taza could stop him, Red Hawk turned and fled into the canyon's maze, vanishing like a ghost into the dust. The riders below took advantage of the distraction, firing again. One bullet struck the cabin wall inches from Ella's face. She ducked, screaming his name. Taza turned. loosing an arrow that buried itself in one man's arm. The others fired wildly, and one of their horses bolted, dragging its rider through the rocks. The last man, bleeding and furious, shouted curses as he retreated. Within minutes, the canyon was silent again, broken only by the wind and Ella's sobs. When Taza returned to her, his face was streaked with blood and dust. "You hurt?" he asked urgently. She shook her head, though her voice trembled. "No, but you are." He ignored it, checking the door, scanning the horizon. "They come back. More men next time. You must leave tonight." "No," she said fiercely. "I'm not leaving you, not now." "You do not understand," he said, his voice breaking for the first time. "Every time I protect you, I make more enemies. My people think me traitor. Yours think me thief. I stand between worlds and both want me dead." She reached out then, her hand trembling as it found his. "Then I'll stand with you," she whispered. "Between both worlds, if that's what it takes." For a moment, he said nothing. The firelight flickered over his face, carving shadows in his eyes. Then he spoke softly, so softly she barely heard. "You are brave," he said. "Braver than most men I have known." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm not brave," she said. "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air like a confession to the stars. For a heartbeat, Taza stood frozen. Then he turned away, his shoulders rigid, his breath uneven. "Love is not enough in this place," he murmured. "The desert takes everything." But she stepped closer, laying her hand against his chest. "Then let it take me too," she said. He closed his eyes, and for the first time, she felt him tremble. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the echoes of the past, of tribes broken, of men lost to hatred, of prayers left unanswered. But inside that little cabin, in the quiet between two heartbeats, something sacred was born. Not peace, not safety, but something far rarer, understanding. And though danger still stalked them, Ella knew one truth that nothing could take away. She had found her heart in the shadow of an Apache's grief, and she would never turn back. The desert slept uneasily that night. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke and gunpowder, as if the land itself had remembered violence. Taza sat at the mouth of the canyon, his bow across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The fire behind him burned low, barely a whisper of flame. He had not spoken since sunset. Ella watched him from the doorway, her heart heavy. She could feel the distance between them now, not born of coldness, but of the weight of all that had happened. The gunfire, the accusations, the knowledge that neither his people nor hers would ever allow what was growing between them. But she also knew something else. She could not leave him. "Taza," she said softly. "You haven't eaten." He didn't turn. "I am not hungry." "You'll need your strength," she said, stepping closer. "You said they might come back." He nodded once, eyes still on the dark distance. "They will." The words sent a chill through her. The hunters, the white men who believed she'd been stolen, would return. Red Hawk might come too, burning with the shame of defeat. Between them both, the canyon could become a grave. "Taza," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We could go. Head north. There are towns where we could—" "No," his tone was final. "They would hunt us there. You would be taken. I would hang." She bit her lip, fighting tears. "Then what do we do?" He looked at her at last, his face carved in moonlight. "We fight," she shook her head, desperate. "There must be another way." "There is none," he said. "I do not fight to live. I fight so you may." Ella's throat tightened. "No," she said fiercely. "Not without you." For a long time he said nothing. Then he reached into the dirt beside him and drew a line with his finger, a simple line winding through the dust. "This is the path," he said quietly. "You follow it north until you see the mountain that looks like a sleeping lion. Beyond that there is water and white men who trade with the tribes. You go there. Tell them you were found, not taken." "Taza," he looked up sharply. "You will go," but she did not move. Her eyes burned with unshed tears and her voice came out as a whisper. "You can't make me." For a long moment the desert was silent. Then something in his face softened, as if he realized the futility of fighting her spirit. He rose to his feet, towering in the pale light. "You are strong," he said quietly. "Stronger than you know. But if you stay, you must be ready for what comes." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then I'll be ready." The night stretched long, full of waiting. The fire burned low, the wind shifting coldly through the rocks. Ella sat near him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything her heart screamed, but the words wouldn't come. Just before dawn, the silence broke. The first sound was faint, the crack of a branch, the echo of distant hooves. Then came the glint of light on steel. Taza's head snapped up. "They come," he said. Ella's heart lurched. "How many?" He didn't answer, only took up his bow and checked his quiver. The stillness of the warrior returned to him, like a mantle he had tried to forget but could never lay down. "Inside," he ordered. She obeyed, though every step away from him felt like betrayal. From the cabin's narrow slit of a window, she saw them emerge from the ridges, 5 riders, their rifles gleaming. Behind them, on the far side of the canyon, came 3 more, Apaches, Red Hawk among them. The 2 groups were not allies. They hated each other, but for this one cause they shared purpose. Taza. Her breath caught. The desert was about to devour itself. Taza stepped forward, bow drawn, his silhouette black against the rising sun. The first shot came from the white riders, sharp, echoing, deadly. The bullet struck the rocks near his feet. He answered with an arrow that struck one man clean in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Then all at once, the canyon exploded into chaos. Gunfire thundered. Arrows hissed through the air. The white hunters shouted curses while Red Hawk's men whooped their battle cries. Taza moved like the wind itself, fast, precise, unrelenting. His arrows never missed, his body flowing from one strike to the next. Ella could barely breathe as she watched. Every time he ducked behind a rock or charged from cover, her heart stopped. She wanted to scream for him to stop, to run, but he fought like a man who had already accepted death. A rifle cracked from the ridge and Taza stumbled, clutching his shoulder. The sight tore a cry from her lips. Without thinking, she burst from the cabin, rushing through the storm of dust and smoke. "Ella, no." He shouted, but she didn't stop. She reached him just as another shot rang out, the bullet grazing her arm. Pain seared through her, but she didn't care. She dragged him toward the cabin, her small frame straining against his weight. Inside, she pushed him down against the wall, blood running down his arm. "Don't you dare die on me," she whispered fiercely, tearing a strip from her skirt to bind his wound. He winced but said nothing, his breath ragged. Outside, the gunfire raged. "They'll burn us out," he muttered. "Then we'll burn with them," she said, eyes blazing. For the first time, he looked at her not as someone to protect, but as an equal. "You are fire," he said softly, "like desert flame." She smiled through her tears. "Then don't put me out." Outside, the sound of hooves grew louder. Shadows passed before the door. Taza struggled to his feet, readying his last arrow. The door burst open and Red Hawk stood there, face smeared with dust and hate. "You should have died with your people," he hissed. Taza raised his bow, but Ella stepped between them. "No!" Red Hawk froze, startled by her defiance. "Enough!" she cried. "How many more will die before the desert has its fill of blood? You say you fight for your people, but you're killing what's left of them." For a heartbeat, even Red Hawk hesitated. His gaze flicked from her to Taza. "You speak like you belong here, white woman," he said bitterly. "But this land will never call your name." "Maybe not," she said, trembling but unyielding. "But it will remember his. Don't make his spirit one more ghost among yours." The words struck something deep within him. Slowly, Red Hawk lowered his weapon. "The white men will kill you both," he said quietly. "Then let them try," Taza answered. Red Hawk stared at him one last time, then turned and vanished into the storm of dust. The remaining white riders, seeing the Apache retreat, gathered their wounded and fled. Within minutes, the canyon fell silent again. The only sounds left were the crackle of the dying fire and the distant cry of a hawk overhead. Ella knelt beside Taza, pressing her forehead to his. His blood soaked her hands, but he was breathing, weakly, stubbornly alive. "You're safe," she whispered. He smiled faintly. "No," he murmured. "You are." And in that moment she realized what he meant. Not that the danger was gone, but that she had crossed the line between fear and faith. Between 2 worlds, she had chosen him. As the sun rose over the canyon, its light fell upon them. 2 souls bound by fire and blood, neither conquered nor saved, but alive. The sun bled across the desert horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The battle was over, but its echoes clung to the canyon like ghosts. Smoke curled from the blackened rocks, the ground littered with spent shells and broken arrows. Ella sat beside Taza, her hands still sticky with his blood. The wind had quieted, the world hushed as though afraid to disturb what was left of them. "Taza," she whispered, "can you hear me?" His eyes fluttered open, dark and full of the same fire that had never left him. "I hear you," he said softly, voice hoarse. She pressed a damp cloth to his wound, praying silently. "You've lost too much blood," he smiled faintly. "I've lost more before." "Not this time," she said fiercely. "You're not dying here. Not after all this." Taza's hand rose, trembling, to brush her cheek. "Why do you stay?" he asked. "Your people will not take you back now. Mine will not accept you." "Because I love you," she said simply, "and I'm done running from what my heart knows." The words hung between them like sunlight after rain, pure, impossible, undeniable. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "You speak as if love can change the world," he murmured. "Maybe it can't," she said, her voice trembling, "but it can change us." He looked at her for a long time, then nodded, as if he finally believed her. For the rest of the day, she nursed him carefully, tearing the cabin's curtains for bandages, feeding him bits of bread and water. When night fell, the stars returned, cold and bright over the desert, the same sky that had watched every sorrow they had endured. By the second day, the bleeding slowed. His color returned. He sat up, weak but alive. "I should have died," he said quietly. "Don't say that," he smiled faintly. "If I had died, I would have carried your name to the spirits." Ella shook her head, tears glimmering in her eyes. "No, you carry it here," she whispered, pressing his hand to her heart. "You're not going anywhere." For a long while they just sat in silence. The wind outside whispered through the canyon, brushing sand against the wood of the old cabin. The world was still like it too was holding its breath for them. Finally Taza said, "We cannot stay. The soldiers will come when the hunters do not return. They will burn this place and call it justice. Then we'll go north," she said, "to the mountain that looks like a lion. You told me about it." He nodded slowly. "There is a valley beyond it, hidden, full of pines and water. My people once called it sacred. Few remember it now." She smiled through her exhaustion. "Then that's where we'll go." They left before dawn the next day. Taza leaned against his horse, weak but standing. Ella gathered what little they could carry: dried meat, a blanket, a small bag of herbs. The desert wind tugged at her hair as she turned for one last look at the cabin. It had been the place where she'd hidden from the world, where she'd feared to live, and where she'd finally learned what love could cost. She took a deep breath. "Goodbye," she whispered. Taza looked back too, his face unreadable. "The desert remembers everything," he said softly, "even love." Then they rode. The days that followed were a blur of heat and dust. The sun was merciless, the land vast and empty, but they pressed on. Sometimes Taza would fall silent for hours, lost in thought. Sometimes Ella would sing softly, old hymns from her childhood, words she no longer believed but still found comfort in. By the fifth day the land began to change. The sand gave way to scrub and stone, then to dry grass and scattered pines. The air grew cooler. When at last they saw the mountain that looked like a sleeping lion, Ella gasped. Its ridges curved like the back of some ancient beast, and beyond it she could see the shimmer of green, a hidden valley just as he'd promised. They made camp near a stream that night. Taza built a small fire, his movements still slow from his wound. Ella cooked what little food they had left. As the sun dipped low, turning the sky a deep burning red, Taza looked at her across the fire. "You should have been a chief's woman," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "And you should have been a poet." He chuckled, a sound she'd rarely heard from him, and the warmth of it filled her chest. "The world would not listen to my words," he said. "Then I will," she whispered. They sat in silence for a time, the crackle of the fire between them, the red sky glowing above like an old wound healing. Finally, he rose and crossed the space between them. His shadow fell over her as he knelt. "Ella," he said, voice low, rough as gravel. "When I first saw you, you trembled like the wind through dry grass. You said you were pure. You were afraid." She nodded, remembering the fear, the trembling, the confusion of that night. "I was," she said softly. He touched her face, his thumb tracing her jaw. "You are still pure," he murmured. "Not because you are untouched, but because your heart is clean." Tears welled in her eyes. "And you?" she asked. "What are you now, Tuzza?" He smiled faintly. "A man who has found peace in the eyes of a woman the world said I could not have." The firelight flickered across their faces as he leaned closer. The air between them felt sacred, alive. She could smell the smoke on his skin, the earth, the wild scent of the desert still clinging to him. Then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate, alive, full of everything they had endured. It tasted of fire and blood and forgiveness. It was the kiss of two souls who had crossed the line between worlds and found something worth dying for. When they parted, the sky above them burned red as if the heavens themselves bore witness. Ella rested her forehead against his chest, feeling his heart beat beneath her cheek. "What happens now?" she whispered. He looked toward the distant valley. "Now we build a life the world will never understand," he said. "But it will be ours." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine from the valley below. The fire crackled, and somewhere far off a wolf howled, a lonely, beautiful sound. Ella closed her eyes and breathed in the desert one last time. She knew she would never be the same. When dawn came, they rode down into the valley together. The light broke over them in waves of gold and crimson, and for the first time since fate had thrown them together, neither of them felt alone. The desert behind them kept its secrets. The old cabin would crumble, the gunfire would fade. The tracks would vanish beneath shifting sands, but somewhere, in that valley of pines, the world would begin again for them. And as the sun rose high, the sky blushing red above the hills, the memory of that kiss, their kiss beneath the red sky, would linger forever.